Hi, and welcome to the e-learning series, It's Not Just Weather, Understanding Plan 2014. This is Part 7, the New York Senate hearing of 2018. Today we're going to focus on the testimony of Frank Sciremammano. Frank was an IJC board member since 1995 and also the longest serving American on the 10-member panel. He's an original member of the IJC study board that was created to create the new plan. He's a co-author of the Minority Report, which can be found on the United Shorelines Ontario website. Frank was fired from the board in 2018, and you'll understand why when you listen to the testimony. Here are some key points out of Sciremammano's testimony. Firstly, Frank says clearly that Plan 2014 didn't cause the flooding because we know that's inflow. But it's just as clear that Plan 2014 does nothing to protect against these extreme levels. Plan 2014 is not capable of protecting against these levels, and Frank assures us that it is biased against the shoreline. Frank explains the limitations of Plan 2014, including the removal of the authority to deviate, the inflexibility and dangers of the triggers, and the fact that Plan 2014 does not consider forecasts. Frank calls on the return to board authority to deviate and for the plan to be rebalanced across all stakeholders.
Mr. Sciremammano, welcome this evening.
Good afternoon. So again, as you said, I will not read my statement. I will try and get to the point. But one of the things I do want to emphasize is that while I am a long-term member of the St. Lawrence River Board since 1995, as well as a member during the entire lifetime of the IJC Study Board that looked at alternative regulations. Tonight, I'm speaking as an individual. I'm not representing the board, not representing the IJC. And I think you'll understand why when I give you my testimony. Let me start by stating very clearly that Plan 2014 did not cause the flooding experienced this year on Ontario. It's also just as clear that Plan 2014 did not protect against extreme levels on the lake, as was stated by the IJC when promoting Plan 2014. If you recall, when they came out with 2014, the first sentence was protecting against extreme levels. It obviously does not do that. And I would argue that Plan 2014 is not capable of protecting against extreme levels on the lake because, one, its very purpose is to increase the frequency of high and low water levels on the lake. And two, the plan is purposely biased toward protecting downstream areas of the St. Lawrence River at the expense of the shoreline communities on Lake Ontario. Further, Plan 2014 prohibits the Lake Ontario St. Lawrence Board from taking preventive measures to avoid extreme lake levels until it's too late to avoid them. And by the way, I would like to answer some of the same questions that you asked the previous speaker because I may give you slightly different answers. In my testimony before this committee on the 10th of October, I explained that Plan 2014 was not one of the regulation plans that was recommended by the study. That instead it came about through some secret meetings and negotiations involving only government officials and environmental advocates, including the New York State DEC. During this negotiation, the province of Quebec insisted its citizens receive no less protection under a new plan than they had under the previous plan. To address this, the damages were shifted to Lake Ontario. I'll not repeat the entire portion of my testimony from that previous time tonight, except to remind you that the IJC stated in 2008 that implementation of the environmental plan, Plan B plus at that point, is not possible without unduly reducing the benefits and protections currently accorded to other interests. The damages were too great. By IJC's own analysis, Plan 2014 is expected to result in damages on Lake Ontario over twice as high as those under that previous environmental plan. The real question is, why are the higher damages in 2017 acceptable when lower damage levels were not acceptable in 2008? In its work, the study board developed guidelines for its recommendations. The guidelines stated that if damages result from any plan, they should not fall disproportionately on any one geographic area or interest group. We recognize there might be damages, but they should be spread. Unfortunately, almost all the damages from Plan 2014 fall to the Lake Ontario shoreline, with a smaller damage to boating on the lake and the Thousand Islands, and I will illustrate that in a minute. The guidelines also state that if damages are anticipated, mitigation and compensation measures should be in place prior to implementation. Plan 2014 has none. Finally, the guidelines state that any plan should be developed in an open process with wide public participation. Plan 2014 was developed in secret by a group that only consulted environmental advocates. To illustrate the first point regarding disproportionate loss, I apologize, that is very small on this screen. It was much bigger at home, and it's much bigger in your handout that I gave you. This is from the IJC, and it is the average net economic benefits or damages to various, I apologize, I have some kind of bug, but I wanted to make sure I came tonight.
No,
so
we understand.
My voice may give out. Municipal industrial water use, commercial navigation, hydropower, coastal, that's us, that's the riparians, and recreational boating. The red indicates losses, the black indicates gains under Plan 2014 relative to the previous plan, 1958 DD. You can see the biggest number, $2.22 million per year on average in additional damages occurs to Lake Ontario landowners, property owners. The only other big number there occurs to Lake Ontario and Alex Bay, Thousand Island recreational boating. Everybody else was held harmless or benefited. So to me, that's disproportionate loss to our area. There are several ways, subtle and not so subtle, in which Plan 2014 is imbalanced and creates this kind of numbers. In my previous testimony, I described the F limit and how it mandates a limit on downstream flooding with no limit on how high Lake Ontario can rise. Tonight, I want to point out another feature of 2014 that assures it cannot protect against extreme water levels, and that's the trigger levels. There was some discussion of that already in response to your questions. I want to go into it a little bit more. Under the previous plan, 1958D, the St. Lawrence River Board had discretionary authority to vary or deviate from the plan calculated outflows under any conditions. Our only constraint was we provide a benefit to one interest without unduly negatively affecting any other. Didn't matter where we were with lake level. We could deviate. Under Plan 2014, discretionary deviations are only allowed to provide benefits to the river interests. If a ship is coming in, we can reduce the flow or increase it. If we have a problem with boat haul-outs, we can do something. If the hydropower has a problem, we can reduce flows. However, deviations that may impact lake levels in any significant way are prohibited until the lake exceeds the predetermined trigger levels. I've attached a graph illustrating the trigger levels and the maximum water levels projected by the IJC under Plan 2014. So let me try and explain this along the bottom. This is quarter month, so that you think of it as calendar year along the bottom. Water levels up here. I think the graph you have may be a little bit easier to read than this. The trigger levels are the lines, low end, high end, and the upper and lower maximum monthly values that the IJC would be achieved by Plan 2014 are shown by the dark triangles. I want to point out first that there's an imbalance between the distance between when the board can do something and what the maximum level is supposed to be on the high end compared to the low end. This was purposely done. The high end was set without getting too much into the weeds at the 2% exceedance level, where the low end had a 90%. As you can see, by the time you hit the trigger level, you're so close to the maximums that there's no way of avoiding it. It's like a truck going down the road and saying you got to stop at a stop sign, but either way, you can't put the brakes on until you're within 10 feet. It doesn't work. The lack of deviation authority by the St. Lawrence Board is troubling, especially to me, given my over 20 years experience working on the board. If we look at right now, Lake Superior is 1 foot above average. Michigan Huron is 1.5 feet above average. Lake Erie is over 1.5 feet above average. And Lake Ontario is just under a foot above average. Based upon this, the board would have discussed whether or not we could deviate or should deviate and let out more water now in anticipation of higher levels in the fall. We may or may not have done that, depending on whatever tools we had, but at least we had the authority to do so. Right now, we do not have that authority because we have not exceeded the trigger. So basically, our role is to implement the plan and apologize for its results until we hit the trigger levels. Let me just summarize by stating that contrary to many of the IJC statements, Plan 2014 will not protect against extreme levels on Lake Ontario. Further, in my opinion, the primary responsibility for this lies with the New York State government in the form of the New York State DEC and the administration, which negotiated Plan 2014 and had to at least acquiesce or approve it before the IJC could go forward. Whenever I point out the inequities in the plan to my colleagues, I'm told simply that my New York State government negotiated and approved the plan. I thank you for your time today. I invite you to look further into this matter. If the state does not act forcefully to modify the terms of Plan 2014, you should be prepared to budget continuing sums of state funding to address damages and economic degradation of our shoreline communities. Happy to address any questions you might have.
You want me to start, or you want to go ahead? Go ahead. It's ready, John. Mark.
Yeah, Frank, what I was going to bring up is we're talking about overshooting the highs right now, and we don't have a mechanism to drain everything. When the rain and the snow come in, they don't stop at the Canadian border. The same extra snow and rain we get is winding up in Quebec in Ontario province. So naturally, when it rains or the snow melts, the Ottawa River is going to be flowing. So even if we want to open up the spigot, we can't do it, as you pointed out. There's a converse situation that could happen. We didn't talk about the lower lows because that's not here right now. But what if we overshoot the highs? We know what happens. With this plan, we can actually overshoot the lows. And then you're going to get, talk about a lousy boating season. All the boats are going to be sitting in mud on the bottom. I mean, right or wrong, we're going to be able to walk out. Everybody's going to have amazing lakefront property. They're going to be able to walk out another 50, 100 feet if we overshoot the low level.
I agree. The low end, I've often been saying, is going to have a much larger economic impact, I believe, to our communities than the high water has. Because the marinas will be out of business. We will not be able to even get into the channels for boating. And the Thousand Islands is really going to suffer. But again, I'm not sure that was accurately reflected in the study. We pointed that out when the IJC was considering Plan 2014. We haven't seen that yet, but when we see it, people will be wringing their hands.
Well, in the 50s, when they set this system up at St. Lawrence Seaway with the dams and everything, that was to basically keep the level of the lake at a certain, within a parameter. The extreme highs and the extreme lows weren't thought of back then. All of a sudden, 60 years later, we're deciding that, well, wait a minute, we're going to have, instead of rising tides and lowering tides, we're going to do it man-made. And, we've had 60 years of wildlife adapting to what we have. All of a sudden now it isn't good enough, right?
Well, I think it's slightly different tact on that. The project was built with the expectation of certain benefits flowing to different areas. Flood control for Montreal, direct benefits in terms of financial and hydropower and jobs, as well as a navigation on Lake St. Lawrence for the river. And for us, explicitly stated that the levels of Lake Ontario would be moderated to avoid extremes, which affect the coastal area. That was what was thrown out by the current decision by the IJC. And to be honest, it's based on their understanding that the environment will be improved by this. I think there's a false assumption that underlies a lot of what was done. The assumption was that the operation of the Plant 58D primarily benefited Lakeshore residents. And it's true it did benefit them to the tune of roughly $25 million a year on average, according to the IJC. But when you look at the other benefits, we're told that the shipping on the St. Lawrence Seaway is a $50 million a day economic impact. That's $13.5 billion a year in economic benefits due to the project. We're told that the hydropower generates 13 terawatt hours of electricity a year. That's an economic benefit. There's also environmental benefits. That 13.5 terawatt hours of energy that's generated would result in over 200,000 tons of CO2 emission a year if it was done with natural gas. So I would argue that the benefits were fine the way they were. There were benefits to the environment, and that we didn't need to make a change in the balance that had been struck for 60 years. But I might add also, that's water under the dam. Now we need to look forward to how can we make some changes to 2014 to better reach an equilibrium or a better balance.
How do you suggest we do that?
Well, I had some technical suggestions, which I'm going to pass on to the GLAM committee, the adaptive management. I believe that the trigger levels are set too high, too close to the upper end. They need to be reduced. More importantly, I think the board should have the authority, if we have a forecast, even if it's only a month in advance, that we're going to exceed a trigger level, we should be able to deviate. We shouldn't have to wait till we hit that level. We should be able to anticipate it. And while I can understand and I appreciate the limits of forecasting, it's pretty clear right now, and I think in the past we would have argued about it, but I think we would have looked forward and said, you know, to be safe, to keep it below 247.3, we probably should release more water right now. And the board cannot do that now.
Questions?
I can relate to you that right after a guy named Trump was elected a year ago, a number of us wrote the president-elect and told him about this proposed Plan 2014 and said to him, we don't know whether this is going to be signed or not by the current president. If he does, we want you to take a look at it and renegotiate it, because we believe what will happen is exactly what happened this last summer. And if he doesn't sign it, we urge you not to sign it when you do become president. We've been assured by a number of elected officials and appointed officials that he is looking at this. Canada is on the north shore of these lakes. We're on the south shore of these lakes. We asked the incumbent governor to go on record back a year and 2 years ago, opposed to this plan because of its effects on the south shores of New York State, of the Lake Ontario, and we never heard anything. I notice in your conclusion that you indicate that you're told simply that yours and mine and your New York State government negotiated this and approved the plan. Do you know that to be true?
What I know is they had to at least acquiesce in it. That was my understanding. We were told that the 5 governments, that's state of New York, province of Quebec and Ontario, and the 2 federal governments all had to agree before it went forward. But that's really a question for the IJC. That's above my pay grade. I don't deal with the political part of it. What I try and deal with is the technical part of it.
I got a couple. Now, you mentioned some secret meetings with New York State. I think you mentioned the DEC being involved in those. Do you have personal knowledge of who was involved in those meetings on behalf of New York State?
I do not. We were just told that a working group was going to be formed. And by the way, somebody asked whether the control board had any input on the study. I was one of 2 people that sat on the control board and was also appointed to the study for input, myself and one of the Canadians. And you see how I came out rejecting so much. So I think someone who knows what was going to happen and what was going on, I think that perspective was ignored. But getting back to your question, I don't have personal knowledge of anything that happened in those negotiations because they were all done in secret.
Do you know what time frame those types of meetings were taking place?
I believe that they formed that working group at around 2008, 2009, and they came out with a recommendation in 2011. They may have continued after that. I don't, that's really a question for the IJC. I don't know.
Yep. Now, you said there was, without recalling all the questions that were asked of the prior witness, there was some different answers you might have to some of those. Can you just point those out for us?
Well, again, I think Assemblyman John said, you know, right now the Lake Ontario is above average. The upper lakes are above average. Would the old board, under old Plan 58D, have the authority to deviate at this point and draw the lake down? And the answer is yes, unequivocally. Do we have the authority now? No, unequivocally. Now, it's true, as the lake goes up, the plan automatically increases the outflow, but the plan doesn't look all the way upstream. All it does is look at the last year of supplies. It looks back to see what happened to adjust the flow. It doesn't look forward. It doesn't even attempt, even in a qualitative manner, to say what may be coming. And I think that's purposeful because they want more variability in the lake. That's the purpose of this plan.
Now, in your experience, and it's extensive since 1995, I think you said on the board, and this year, 2017, has kind of been described as a perfect storm, with everything happening all at once, and you yourself have not pinpointed 2014 for causing the flooding that we had. But prospectively, historically, how often do the downstream issues, the flooding from the Ottawa River and the basins downstream, get flooded at different times than the lake area is high? You know, how often do they coincide, I guess, both being high at the same time? Because certainly I understand that the outflows at a certain point in time on the charts that were shown before would have exacerbated flooding downstream. And with 4,000 people being dislocated from their homes, I understand that. But how often do these combine together in this kind of perfect storm scenario in your experience?
Well, generally in April and May, the Ottawa River does peak, usually has two peaks. Generally during that time, the flow does have to be reduced from Lake Ontario in order to maintain adequate levels downstream. But usually it's a very short-lived period of time, matter of weeks. And generally we're not having the supplies that we had on Lake Ontario at the same time. This year was truly exceptional. I mean, I concur in what our control board members, their presentation, that this year the rainfall was over 40 days. It was biblical, pardon the pun. And it really, no system and no plan would have accomplished what we all would like, which is to limit the flooding downstream and on the lake. I'm more concerned with Plan 2014 in general, and the fact that even under non-extreme conditions like this year, it's going to allow levels above 247.3 up to 248, 248.5 as being acceptable. And I think that at that point we're getting a lot of damage. But I think this year could not have been avoided.
It looks like your chart here certainly has the trigger points at or above that 247.3 level from week 13 to week 31.
Yes,
so that's a significant portion of the year.
Yes, and in the past, the board would have looked at 247.3, which was what people were told the lake would be kept under, and try our best to keep it under there. Now, it did exceed it in 73 and 93, but in the 20 years I've been on the board, we've never exceeded it. I think the board has gotten better at anticipating, forecasting, and adapting the flow. So I would disagree that nothing could ever have been done. This year was the exception, but I think we've had 20 years where we have not exceeded 247.3. We've come close a couple of times, but in those cases, the board had the authority to deviate and did so pretty aggressively.
Thank you. Pam, you have some? Oh, you don't? Okay. Anyone else? I think that's it.
Thank you
very
for
much.
your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Want more? You can watch Frank Sciremammano's interview with the Democrat and Chronicle June 5th of 2018 at this link. Up next, Part 8, What Needs to Happen Now?